So at the end of the First World War, there was a widespread feeling that something had to be done to reimpose some form of constraint, some form of limitation on the extent of the waging of war if world society were to be able to avoid the immense costs to life and limb and property that were imposed by the waging of that war. And one of the early important statements in that effort was a famous speech to the US Congress by the American president of the time, Woodrow Wilson, in which he proposed 14 points for peace. And the best known of those 14 points was effectively the proposal for a League of Nations, an association which would ensure the territorial integrity of large and small states alike. So it was the beginning of a charter for rights, but note, not human rights, not individual rights, and in fact, but states' rights, the rights of states to expect to be able to continue with their normal functioning without being bullied, without being invaded by other states. Now, the League of Nations was formed as a way to try to avoid repetition of World War I, and it did enjoy some successes, but it fell into disrepute when important countries began to refuse to be bound by it. The Japanese, for example, in the China crisis of the 1930s and their occupation of Manchuria, the Italians in Abyssinia. And ultimately, the world, as you know, lapsed into a repeat performance, even more destructive of human life this time in the Second World War. But that served only to sharpen the imperative in many people's minds to form and promulgate a charter for states' rights in order to try to avoid such things in future, and that, of course, was the United Nations Charter. Now, in the UN Charter, there are only two circumstances in which the use of force can be seen as lawful. Firstly, in self-defense. Nothing in the Charter should interfere with the rights of states to defend themselves when they are under attack. And secondly, when there is a risk to international peace and security. But the Security Council of the United Nations has the sole prerogative to decide when such a situation exists and how to respond. So they were just two circumstances in which the use of force was lawful. Now, the period since the end of the Cold War has seen a clustering of challenges to that situation, to that status quo, if you like, the post-war consensus, because people have wanted to propose new and different situations in which the use of force should be seen as lawful. One of them is the so-called war on terrorism, with its definition of enemy combatant, somebody who is neither a soldier and therefore entitled to the protections of the Geneva Convention as a prisoner of war, nor a civilian and entitled to the protection of the presumption of innocence until proven guilty. So that's one of them. Another one of them is put forward in the National Security Strategy of the Bush administration in 2002, and it's the doctrine of so-called preemptive self-defense. And it says that America will strike at such threats as a matter of common sense before they are fully formed, which is a highly significant phrase. And the third one is the so-called responsibility to protect. And that has acquired increasing salience because wars have increasingly been fought, or at least presented to publics as being fought for human protection, to protect human beings against the depredations of states and governments. So in former Yugoslavia, over Kosovo, for example, in 1999, the invasion of Iraq was presented in the first place as a security measure in response to Iraq's weapons of mass destruction, but later also to try to get rid of an abusive dictator and replace that system with a democracy. Latterly, the invasion of Libya, which is a bit of a specimen case, really, because it was on the back of a United Nations Security Council resolution providing explicitly for force to be used for human protection purposes, and then even that kind of rhetoric has been flying around in connection with proposals to intervene in various forms in Syria as well. So this is an era in which people have been agitating away at the limitations bequeathed in the UN Charter and the post-war consensus to try to devise and propose further circumstances in which force can be used.